Well, there's a moment right at the end of the film called The Two Towers, the second part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where the people of Rohan are besieged inside the failing fortress of Helm's Deep. The enemy armies outnumber them, and the situation seems helpless as the men are fighting and dying on the city walls. Inside, women and children and the elderly are cowering. And facing defeat, facing death, facing the demise of his people, King Theoden utters these words: "So much death. What can men do against such reckless hate?" When faced with the relentless and seemingly unstoppable triumph of evil, as hope fades, Theoden asks, what can men do against such reckless hate? Well, have you ever asked that sort of question yourself? For example, when Russian troops invaded Ukraine a couple of years ago, if you saw pictures of the bodies on the streets in Bucha, such a question was apt. Watching on our TVs, feeling helpless, many people asked, what could we do? Many were so outraged that they hoisted Ukrainian flags on their homes or on their social media accounts to show solidarity. Or what about when you heard about the murder of Sarah Everard, abducted off the streets of Clapham in 2021? Again, the question was apt, what could be done against such reckless hate? In the face of such despicable violence against women, many took to the streets in protest, attended vigils, signalled their horror on social media. Those are just two recent high-profile examples. Sadly, there are many more. But in our time together this morning, our passage is going to help us think about this question. What can man, that is men and women, do against such reckless hate? Now, this is a really relevant issue. Whether you're looking into the Christian faith and trying to work out whether it all stacks up, or if you've been a Christian for decades and you need encouragement when you find yourself weeping at injustice, either because you face it or because you stand with others. Well, this morning we are continuing our series, The Hidden Hand of God, based on the book of Esther. If you've been here over the last few weeks, we've said how Esther is the one book of the Bible where God isn't mentioned. And yet, it is the dramatic story of how God worked through one woman and one man to save his people and ultimately rescue the world. Back in chapters 1 and 2, we met King Xerxes. He was on the throne in Persia. That was the world superpower of the day. And though he was powerful, there were hints that real power lies elsewhere. By the end of chapter 2, Xerxes was in the debt of Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew, one of God's people, and Esther, who was Mordecai's cousin and adopted daughter, was now queen. But last week, if you were here in chapter 3, we saw the appointment of a new prime minister, Haman. But he brought with him a diabolical and genocidal plot to kill all of God's people. And this week we're going to pick up the story as God's people come to terms with this terrifying news. And we'll see what their response to this decree of death, what this response teaches us about how we would answer that question. What can man do against such reckless hate? What does their response teach us? Firstly, number one, express your distress. Express your distress. Come with me to verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. In that culture, these actions were a well-known sign of grief and of distress. They were normally coupled with prayer. It's safe to assume that Mordecai would also have prayed. But what we're told in verse 2 is that because of his mourning, Mordecai was no longer able to enter the king's gate. Presumably no one was allowed to enter near the king wearing sackcloth, since the king didn't want to be depressed by sad people. And then in verse 3, the camera zooms out to show weeping across the whole empire. In every province, all 127 of them, if you remember chapter 1, there was great mourning, fasting, weeping, wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. It's a truly desperate scene. But what does it teach us about how we're to respond to injustice? Well, firstly, let me say, don't deny God's existence. Why do I say that? Well, the existence of injustice and of hatred in the world leads many people to dismiss the idea of God altogether. Take, for example, Richard Dawkins. He wrote this: "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Now, it won't surprise you to know that I think there are several problems with this view, not least how you can define good and evil without God. But fundamentally, I think this sort of view jars with how many of us live and how we are hardwired to feel about injustice. Like Mordecai and God's people in Susa, people across the world mourn and grieve because life matters. How we live, how we die, it's not simply a matter of pitiless indifference. It matters supremely before God. So let me say this morning, if you're looking into the Christian faith, let me say, don't let the presence of injustice in the world lead you to deny God's existence. Why? Well, because deep down, the very reason we feel aggrieved by injustice is because ultimately the Bible tells us, as men and women, we are made in the image of God, in the image of a God who is perfectly just. So firstly, don't deny God's existence. Secondly, Esther teaches us to beware detachment. What do I mean by that? Well, come back with me to Susa, where we see a stark contrast. While the streets have become a river of tears, picture Esther sitting comfortably on the palace veranda. Until, that is, she hears that Mordecai is making a bit of a scene, going around in sackcloth in the city, tearing his clothes. Just picture an embarrassed Esther asking herself, what's Daddy wearing now? He really should know sackcloth isn't a good look. No, send him a new jacket from the palace tailors and a pair of Timberlands. He'll look better in those. But Mordecai won't accept such a shallow and superficial response. He sends the clothes straight back. And so Esther summons Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, and he goes off to try and find out the real reason why Mordecai is distressed. And here's the challenge for us. Notice here how Esther is so cocooned in the palace. She doesn't know what's going on. Her distance and her detachment from the reality of suffering and the death sentence hanging over her people, it's brought home time and time again in our passage by Hathach's shuttle diplomacy, carrying messages between Esther and Mordecai. And before we're too critical of Esther, isn't this often a danger for us in the West? We can really easily be detached, I think, from the reality of what goes on in the world. It's easy to go about living our lives pretending everything is fine. And as a result, I think we can easily give shallow and superficial responses without realizing the gravity of what's going on. So secondly, I think this passage teaches us to beware detachment. Thirdly, in their distress, Mordecai and God's people show us that it's okay to not be okay. You see, their response in these verses show us that deep distress is a right response to injustice. Injustice can't just be swept aside, solved with a British stiff upper lip. Let me say, as Christians, we shouldn't try to suppress how we feel and pretend everything's fine when it isn't. As Christians, it's important that we're honest with one another, that we grieve together at what we see in the world, and that we share our burdens and our pains with one another in church. It's okay to not be okay. But back to our big question at the start. What can man do against such reckless hate? Well, firstly, very simply, express your distress. Secondly, we're to trust in God's promises. We're to trust in God's promises. Let's cut back to our story, verse 6, where Hathach finds Mordecai. And since Esther hasn't been following the news, Mordecai sends Hathach back with a copy of the morning papers and some urgent instructions. And Mordecai's memo to Esther is simple. It's to the point. It's urgent. Esther, you must go to the king. You have Xerxes' ear. Please plead with him for your people. To which Esther's response, in sum, you must be joking. One does not simply walk into the palace. Everyone knows, and you should know, Mordecai, no one goes to the king unless they've been invited. You see behind me a picture, an illustration of what the Persian court looked like. The king is sitting down, and in his right hand is his scepter. Historians tell us that around the king of Persia were a squad of men ready to hack down any intruder who approached the king uninvited, unless the king extended his golden scepter to restrain his men as the person approached. And given Xerxes' track record in discarding Vashti, his previous queen, what hope did Esther have? And even more, the little detail in verse 11 tells us that it had been 30 days since Esther was last called to him. Esther had been queen for 5 years. Perhaps the passion had cooled. And given the fact they certainly hadn't had sex for a month, the situation looked deeply unpromising, particularly given Xerxes' love of many women. But look carefully at how Mordecai responds. Another message gets sent back to Esther. Verse 13, what does it say? He sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. And at this point, we might think that Mordecai would add, so if you don't act, Esther, we're all doomed. Doomed. But is that what Mordecai says? Have a look, verse 14. This is the key verse of the book. What does Mordecai say? Esther, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Do you see what's going on here? Mordecai has faith. Even though God's hand is hidden, Mordecai believes that God's people will not be annihilated. But why? How? On what basis does Mordecai believe this? Well, very simply, Mordecai believed in God's promises. He trusted in the promise that God had made many hundreds of years before to Abraham. The verses are behind me on the screen, Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. In sum, God had promised to make Abraham's descendants into a great nation, and that through them, all the peoples of the world would ultimately be blessed. And Mordecai, well, he believed in God's promise. And so he trusted that deliverance would come one way or another. And what about for us now? Well, the Bible is full of promises that we can trust, reminding us that even in times of trial, God is still in control. reminding us that one day Jesus Christ will come back. He will finally come back to end all injustice and evil in the world. We'll think about that over the next couple of weeks. He will come back to bring his children home. And in the meantime, well, we're called to walk by faith and not by sight. And for Esther, that was the big question. Would she walk by faith? Would she play her part? And so what does Mordecai say? Verse 14. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? You see, all of Esther's life had been leading up to this moment. How is she going to respond? Well, it leads us to our third response. What can man do against such reckless hate? The third response, courageous action. It was once famously said, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. And up until this point in the book, it appeared that Esther would do nothing. See, she's largely been passive. Esther needed to decide who would she stand with. If we'd been part of God's people back then, how confident would you have been in Esther's decision? Given her track record, given the years of moral compromise in the palace of a pagan king. One commentator says, it would be like hoping that the boss of your company, who's become successful by fiddling the books and by neglecting his family, it would be like hoping that that boss would now make the right ethical decision in the boardroom. How much hope would you have in such a person? Which way would Esther go? Would she go deeper undercover in the world? Or would she stand for her people? And just in case we overlook this, just think about how hard it would have been for Esther. She could, I think, easily have doubted. I haven't told anyone about my identity for 5 years. Surely it's too late now to tell people. They'll think I'm a fraud. And what's more, surely God is done with me. Given my mistakes, surely I'm beyond hope. I'm sure that many of us would have felt that in her shoes. But is that how she responded? Have a look down with me at verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther's response, courageous action. Notice she doesn't just ask for the people to fast. Esther commits to fasting herself and with her attendants. And don't miss how that in itself was a massive step of faith. Just think about it for a moment. What do we know about Xerxes from this book? Well, Xerxes was obsessed with how his women looked. Remember chapter 2, the Miss Persia contest. His women had 12 months of beauty treatments before they came to him. Think of the cosmetics bills that the palace racked up with Jo Malone and Chanel. And as well as the endless spa treatments, before Esther came to the king for the first time, chapter 2, verse 9, she was even given special food. But now for Esther. What was her strategy to persuade the king? Get prepped with some pampering at Susa's finest spas? No. 3 days of fasting. After which, I imagine, she wouldn't have felt or have looked at her best in order to go and persuade the king. But nevertheless, she commits to fast, demonstrating her utter dependence on God. And as she goes, what does she say? If I perish, I perish. And so as Esther agrees to take this courageous action, and as Mordecai scuttles off to carry out Esther's instructions, well, chapter 4 closes on a cliffhanger. The hope of God's people on death row now hangs, as one writer puts it, on the fate of a weak and vulnerable believer who has agreed to enter the place of power in the universe, pledging her life to mediate and plead for her people. So how does this courageous action apply to us? Now, as Christians, I think we probably want to move from Esther and consider how we can take courageous action to serve God in such a time as ours. But not so fast. First of all, Esther points us in a different direction, to one whose courageous action in the face of injustice ultimately saved his people. Esther points us to another weak and vulnerable believer who went to the place of power and judgment to plead for the deliverance of his people. Esther points us to a greater mediator who didn't just say, "If I perish, I perish." Brave as that was, she points us to Jesus, the one who willingly faced down death as he laid down his life to save his people. Now, back in Susa, it was highly risky for Esther to enter the king's presence. Today, you and I have a more fundamental problem than that. Not because God is like Xerxes. Thankfully, he isn't. But the problem we have is that we cannot enter the presence of God because he is holy. That means he's morally perfect. And we are not. You see, in this world, we're all ultimately part of a problem. There is an evil that lurks in every human heart. And the Bible tells us that because of our sin, well, we deserve death. We cannot waltz into the presence of God. But by going to the cross for our sakes, by dying in our place, Jesus' courageous action is what brings salvation for you and me, if we put our trust in him. It's his courageous action that brings salvation for his people. And so firstly, let's rejoice that Esther's courageous action points us to Jesus. And then, and only then, secondly, if you're a follower of Jesus today, well, Esther's courageous action foreshadows the courage that we're called to have as Christians. You see, in our lives, the challenge comes to each of us. Who will we identify with? Will we identify with God and with his people, or with the world? And do we live our lives recognizing that God has placed us here now for such a time as this? In our workplaces, on your street, in our families, in our social groups. And to those who live around us, what does our speech, what does our silence communicate about whether we belong to God or to the world ultimately? And when we might face hostility or danger, I think it's easy to leave other Christians to speak up and to keep our heads down. But note, like Esther, even if you've been an undercover Christian at work for 5 years, if no one knows that you're a Christian, it is not too late to speak up. As a general principle, the longer you're quiet about your faith, the harder it is to speak up. The cost goes up. But it's important to remember that when you start a new job as a Christian, for example. But this coming week, whatever's in the past, why not pray? What can I do in courageous faith that will count for God's glory? And even when we've made mistakes, even when we find ourselves in circumstances that we might wish had never happened, perhaps like Esther, well, maybe we need to hear these words, that God has placed us just where we are for such a time as this, so that even in difficulty, we can live for him. You see, for Esther, her life's defining moment was in verse 15. when, whatever the outcome, she chose to identify with God's people. And it was at this point that she assumed the dignity of her position as queen. You see, up until this point in the story, it had been Mordecai giving all the instructions. That changes from now on. 14 times in this book, Esther is called Queen Esther. 13 of the 14 times occur after this point in the story. Her decision at this point changed her life and the lives of her people as they faced reckless hate. Come back for more of that next week. But back to the Battle of Helm's Deep. As King Theoden asked, what can men do against such reckless hate? Well, if you know the film, Theoden's decision to ride out and personally confront the invading army was arguably his finest moment. Well, what about us today? What can we do against such reckless hate? Well, this passage has taught us. We're to express our distress. We're called, we're invited to trust in God's promises. And most fundamentally and wonderfully, we can rejoice that Esther points us to Jesus Christ, who has courageously acted on our behalf to save us from sin and from death, to bring hope into the horrors of this world. So in his strength, with his help, let's take courage and live for him. Let's pray.